our ambassadors in this room. So, hello everyone. I'm happy. I'm happy to host today Professor Ohad Nachtomy. He's coming for us from the Technion. The talk will be in English, not because problems of Hebrew, but since we have a few guests here who are more who are less fluent in Hebrew. So the talk will be in English. Is the head of the Humanities and Arts Department at the Technion, which is the Israel Institute of Technology. Ohad's works is on early modern philosophy, philosophy and history of biology, mind-body relations, Wittgenstein philosophy, and multicultural theory, especially in the Israeli context. He began studying philosophy and history of science at the Hebrew University, went later to Columbia University, where he had his PhD on a thesis on Leibniz, a Leibnizian approach to possibility. And since then, much of his research is on Leibniz. He spent time at various important institutes, like the Institutes for Advanced Study in Paris and in Princeton. He was for many years faculty members at the Bar-Ilan University, and as I said, now is at the Technion as the head of the newly made Department for Humanities and Arts. And among his publications, I would mention his two last books. One is Living Mirrors, Infinity, Unity, and Life in Leibniz Philosophy, which appeared in 2019. And in the same year appeared with his book with Eyal Shifroni, The Psychophysical Lab, Yoga Practice and the Mind-Body Problem. So please, and as you see, the talk connected to his latest book on Leibniz, on 3 degrees of infinity in Leibniz.
Thank you, Shaul. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also an opportunity to get back to real stuff and not just administrative business that is not so interesting. I've been taking most of my time the previous 2 years. So I'm very happy to the opportunity. I'll say that the title of the talk is slightly misleading. I decided to basically try to give a broader picture of what I take to be or some of what I think belongs to Leibniz's view of infinity, or more specifically, the way he uses infinity in his philosophy. I don't argue for any particular interpretation or thesis here, but I basically want to try to convince you that it's a interesting, enriched, and promising field of research. So let me start with just a very general puzzle that we find, I think, in Leibniz. So here is a very famous quote from Leibniz that goes directly against Aristotle, saying that, nature abhors infinity. So Leibniz says, I'm so much in favor of actual infinity that instead of admitting that nature rejected as it is vulgarly said, I hold that it affects it everywhere for better marking the perfections of its author. In newly edited text, he says much the same, that nature abhors the infinite, as is commonly boasted, is so far from the truth that, on the contrary, everything rather finally resolved into the infinite. And we know that infinity plays an important role in almost every facet of Leibniz's metaphysics. He's well known for the thesis that the actual world is one of infinitely many possible worlds. These infinite possible worlds are conceived by God's infinite intellect, and God himself is seen as an infinite and most perfect being. the actual world also consists of infinitely many individual substances, each of which expresses all others, such that it stands in infinite relations to infinitely many others and exhibit an infinite series of operations. And likewise, for Leibniz, each portion of matter may be conceived as a garden full of plants and as a pond full of fish, but each branch of every plant, each member of every animal, each drop of its liquids is also some such garden or pond. But, so, I mean, this is also a quote, everything in nature goes to infinity, but at the same time, we have a very clear rejection of infinite number, shape, length, and all such things. So this comes out very early in Leibniz in 1672. So, I mean, you can understand, of course, the original here, numerus infinitus is et impossibilis, non unum, non totum, but nihil, ergo numerus infinitus is zero. So, an infinite number is impossible, it's not a unity, it's not a whole, but it's nothing. Okay, it's very clear what's going on here. So the immediate question is how to reconcile the use of so, widespread use of infinity in, as I already indicated, in almost every aspect of philosophy, or saying that infinite quantity is basically impossible. So there is no such a thing. So that's kind of the general the puzzle. And there is an interesting, particularly interesting illustration of this question that regards the issue of how Leibniz defines living beings. So this is from the Monadology. The previous quote was from 67. This is from 70. As we see that each living body has a dominant entelechy, which in the animal is the soul, but the limbs of this living body are full of other living beings, plants, animals, each of which also has its entelechy or its dominant soul. So there is this kind of structure of living beings that are kind of nested one within the other, presumably to infinity. And so he writes elsewhere, it's a letter to Lady Masham, I define an organism or a natural machine. The term organism here is a bit misleading, but it's kind of sidelined to our topic, so I just leave it as it is. But I define an organism or a natural machine as a machine, each of whose parts is a machine. So the point we say, but by natural machine, he refers basically to living things. So that's the idea. So that as a machine, each of its parts is a machine. So this is really, I think, important. So also you see this kind of nested structure of a natural machine. And consequently, the subtlety of its artifice extends to infinity, nothing being so small as to be neglected, whereas the parts of artificial machines are not machines. This is the essential difference between nature and art, which our moderns have not considered sufficiently. Okay, so again, I think that we see that the notion of infinity in some sense belongs to the very definition of how I understand the living world. Which is why I put this this picture on the cover of the book. Okay. So I also want to emphasize the point that for Leibniz, the issue of living beings is not just a point about, biology, but for Leibniz, the idea that things are living really constitutes reality. I mean, so omnia esse animata. So everything that exists is a living being. So that's kind of the foundation of reality, to do with activity and life. So this is a very fundamental point. Okay. So now I want to go a bit more to basically cover a few distinctions and conceptions that are important to understand the broader picture. All right. So a natural place For both historical and conceptual grounds, to begin the presentation, the way Leibniz employs infinity in his philosophy is his clear and consistent rejection of infinite number. From the very beginning of his serious work in mathematics to the very end of his career, Leibniz was very clear in arguing that an infinite number is impossible, or what amounts to the same thing for him, that the notion of infinite number involves a contradiction. What Leibniz means by saying that an infinite number is nothing, as we've seen in the previous quote, may not be very clear. So it's worth observing that in 1671, just before this letter to Galois, where he says that that infinity is nihil, he defines nihil as whatever can be named but cannot be thought. It turns out that this definition corresponds very well to Leibniz's more elaborate approach regarding the notion of infinite number and some other quantitative notions, such that that he often juxtaposes, such as infinite line or greatest shape, all of which he deems to be impossible. He sees such notions as, I quote, something that can be named but cannot be thought. That is a concatenation of terms that upon analysis turns out to be contradictory, and thus refers to no idea at all. On this account, expressions such as infinite number or the longest line are made up in our language by a composition of terms that in fact do not refer to any ideas. Intuitively, the contradiction in the concept of infinite number, which he equates to the number of all numbers, arises from the observation that that every number is finite and assignable, and so every line is also finite and assignable. I mean, this is a very intuitive notion of what number is, it's just something that is bound, finite. So if the very nature of number is specified sum or assignable aggregate of unit, the idea of unlimited number of units makes no sense. As Leibniz puts this in his notes from Paris, the last number will always be greater than the number of all number. This is the quote. Whence it follows that the number of all numbers is not infinite. Neither, therefore, is the number of unities. Therefore, there is no such a thing as infinite number. That is, it's not possible. For historical and conceptual accuracy, let us note that Leibniz's reasoning is a bit more involved. His rejection of infinite number is informed by his reading of Galileo Dialogues in Two Sciences during 1672 and 73, and his response to a paradox that Galileo articulates there. In its simplest form, Galileo paradox arises when we compare two infinite series, such as the series of natural numbers. Where do I have it? Yeah, I have it there. So the series of natural numbers is the series of their squares. It's easy to show that each number in the one series can be correlated with the number on the other. Each number with its square, right? 1 with 1, 2 with 4, 3 with 9, and so on to infinity. Such that the two series would stand in one-to-one relations to one another, and thus would seem to be equal in number. At the same time, the series of natural numbers seems to be larger than the series of squares, since it includes members that are not included in the series of squares, such as 3, for example. Thus, one might say that the series of natural numbers is both larger than and equal to the series of its squares, or that the series of squares is smaller than and equal to the series of the natural numbers. And this is Galileo's paradox. Galileo's response to this paradox was to claim that the fundamental relations of quantity, smaller than, equal to, and larger than, do not hold at the realm of infinity. Leibniz's response was to argue that this would violate Archimedes' axiom that the whole is larger than its parts, and therefore infinite number, understood naively, must be regarded as impossible. But if one is to use infinity in mathematics and philosophy as extensively as Leibniz does, a more nuanced and sophisticated approach to the interpretation of infinite quantities must be developed. And this is one of Leibniz's most central motivations for developing the subtle approach to infinity. Indeed, as Richard Arthur, among others, has shown, the development of his syncatagrammatic approach to infinity is one of Leibniz's main achievements already during his early years in Paris. This is, we're talking 1672, 1676. The 4 years spent in Paris, by the way, were among the most fertile, and he also invented or started to work on the calculus, invented the calculating machine, he developed binary notation, he did a lot of stuff. Okay. Now, Leibniz's critique of infinite number needs to be situated in a particular historical and philosophical context. That is, as part of his approach to possibility, and in particular, his attempt to distinguish between possibilities and impossibilities by providing possibility, what he also calls causal or genetic definitions. In his notes from Paris, Leibniz frequently uses the notion of infinite number as well as infinite line or most rapid notion and the largest shape as examples of inconsistent notions. Leibniz's concerns about the consistency of the notion of infinite number are at the background of his concerns about the consistency of the notion of infinite or most perfect being. In 1676, we find Leibniz attempting to demonstrate that the notion of the most perfect being is possible. So, wait, this doesn't, okay, I was going to look at this. So here he writes, yeah. So this is a bit later. We think about this greatest speed, something that has no idea since it is impossible. Similarly, the greatest circle of all is an impossible thing, and the number of all possible units is no less so. We have a demonstration of this, and nevertheless, we think about all this, and that is why we're surely, and that is why there are surely grounds for wondering whether we should be careful about the idea of the greatest of all things, and whether it might not contain a contradiction. So I take this to show that Leibniz was dissatisfied with the Cartesian proof for the existence of God, right? So you assume that God is the most perfect being, but Leibniz already worries about this assumption, since in itself the definition requires proof. Why? Because it may turn out that if you understand the notion of the most perfect being as sort of including all perfections, this might be analogous to a number including all unities. So this analogy, I think, is at the background of the sort of previous point that we should be skeptical about the idea of the most perfect being. We should worry about this. And I mean, this is a bit of my reading here, but I think it seems to me pretty obvious that what's in the background is precisely concern about impossible notions, such as the greatest number, the greatest shape, and so on, that demand that we should provide proof for concept of the most perfect being. Okay. Leibniz actually doesn't publish anything of a proof that the most perfect being is possible. I mean, there is such a proof in the notes. I don't know if it's very convincing or not, but he basically assumes something like, assume subject of all perfections. These perfections are positive and are cannot be analyzed, and so he argues, since they're positive by definition, there won't be contradictions among them. And so a subject that contains all perfection, he argues, is possible. And so that's and if this notion is possible, then Descartes' proof goes through. So existence of the perfection, and the rest God exists, basically. It's kind of a supplement. Okay, so I want to move on to what I think is needed for Leibniz in order to argue for a disanalogy between the notion of the most perfect being and the largest or infinite number. If you want infinite being and infinite number. And this is basically, I think, a distinction between a quantitative and non-quantitative sense of infinity. I mean, this is very complicated and interesting, but I think it is required. I mean, it's especially difficult to account for a non-quantitative sense of infinity. But all right. So I think that the most significant distinction Leibniz needs in order to defend his position is between quantitative and non-quantitative sense of infinity. The quantitative sense applies to magnitudes and is mainly used in a single figure quantity sense. I'll spell this out in a bit later. The non-quantitative sense of infinity is seen as absolute infinity, which primarily, but not exclusively, applies to God or the most perfect being. Intuitively, the infinity that the tradition ascribes to God is not one of size or magnitude. But this intuition is not crystal clear, especially if the definition of God is spelled out in terms of his infinite perfections, as we find in Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, just as an example. The comparison between an infinite being and infinite number helps to clarify the sense in which infinity applies to the most perfect being. According to Leibniz, the most perfect being does not admit of part-whole relations, which constitutes the science of quantity. Rather, it has absolute unity and perfection, such that it is beyond measure in the sense that it cannot be understood in quantitative terms. So this is, I think, a point that is very important for this distinction, and actually, I think one that would also later apply to these notions of beings in general, not just God, but also created beings. The idea that there are unities that cannot be understood in the model of parts and wholes, even though they have, multiple of constituents, whatever. Still, the part-whole model is not the right one. In the new essays. In the new essays on human understanding, Leibniz notes that the true infinite is only in the absolute, which is anterior to any composition and is not formed by the addition of parts. And here, too, we also find an articulation of this idea. Unlike a number, the true infinite is not composed or formed by the addition of parts or units. Rather, it is prior to any composition. In this sense, it does not belong to the category of quantity. It's crucial to observe that Leibniz relates the absolute infinity of God to absolute unity. As he notes in the letter to De Vos, only absolute and indivisible infinity has true unity, namely God. And in the same correspondence, he writes, I maintain, strictly speaking, that an infinite composed from parts is neither one nor whole, and it is not conceived as a quantity, except through a fiction of the mind. The indivisible infinite alone is one, but it is not a whole. That infinite is God. So it's not a whole. It's like the unity of God is not a unity of its parts. It's a non-quantitative unity, I think we also said. For Leibniz, then, God is not considered a whole because it does not consist of parts, and thus does not admit of part-whole relations, which is the fundamental axiom governing the science of quantity. These texts suggest that Leibniz conceives of the infinity of God not in terms of quantity or magnitude or of some particular thing, be it as great, large, or long as it may, but rather he conceives of the infinity of God in terms of absolute perfection. It is, however, far from easy to explicate the sense of infinity in positive terms. In the Monadology, Leibniz provides the following explication. I don't think I have this quote here. God is absolutely perfect, perfection being nothing but the okay. Yeah, I know why I didn't put it on. Because it does have the notion of quantity in it, which is kind of strange. So, but let me read it to you. So God is absolutely perfect, perfection being nothing but the magnitude of positive reality considered as such, setting aside the limits or bounds of the things which have it. And here there are no bounds. That is, in God, perfection is absolutely infinite. So the notion of absolute perfection is explicated here as a positive reality considered as such, an obstruction of any instantiation. Even though Leibniz is using the term magnitude here, it reads more like a measure or degree of positive reality. And I think that it cannot be regarded as a quantitative and will therefore call it qualitative infinity. As we'll see, okay, anyway, this is not so important. So let me move on to this interesting point about degrees of infinity. The qualification of God as absolutely infinite calls to mind Spinoza's distinction between the absolute infinity of God and the infinity in kind of God's attributes. Indeed, even before the Ethics was published, Leibniz had the occasion to read Spinoza's letter to Ludwig Meyer, which was sent in 1663 on the question of the infinite. Luckily, Leibniz not only read and saved Spinoza's letter, but also annotated and commented on it. And I mean, I say luckily because this is how we have the letter, I mean, because he saved it. In Spinoza's letter, Leibniz could find the gist of a solution to his own problem, namely a distinction between kinds of infinity applied respectively to substance, attributes, and modes. Yet it's curious and significant that Leibniz rephrases Spinoza's threefold distinction between kinds of infinity in terms of degrees. As he writes, I set in order of degree, omnia maximum infinitum. While Leibniz does not, so the infinitum is the tantum infinitum, the mere infinite. So, while Leibniz does not often state this threefold distinction explicitly, I'll try to show that each of these notions plays an important role in his philosophy. It is clear that Leibniz ascribes the lowest degree of infinity to mathematical notions, or more generally to beings of reason. It is also clear that he ascribes the highest degree or the absolute sense of infinity to God. But the intended use of the indeterminate degree of infinity, the infinite in kind or maximum, is less clear. Central thesis of this book, the one I published in 2019, is that between the absolute infinity that Leibniz ascribes to the most perfect being and the lowest degree of infinity that he ascribes to entiam fractionis, he presupposes an intermediate degree of infinity and being, which may apply to created living beings. Unlike most thinkers in the period, for Leibniz, created beings are also infinite, but their infinity must be distinguished from the absolute infinity of God and from the mere infinity of series and other beings of reason. Indeed, the infinity adequate to created beings may well be described as infinity in kind, in distinction from the absolute infinity of God, and also a distinction from the mere infinity of, let's say, mathematical series. So that's a point that I argued for in the book that, oh, wait, sorry, I didn't move on. Okay, this is the quote where he draws a distinction. So I usually say that this is conversations that Leibniz has with Chironius. Chironius is, a mathematician, was Spinoza's friend, and they meet in Paris and they talk about the ethics. Chironius, by the way, is a copy of the Ethics, which he doesn't show Leibniz. So Spinoza, is very careful about not showing the Ethics to people that he doesn't fully trust. And Leibniz turned out to be one of those people he doesn't fully trust, and for a good reason. Of course, he would, send it all over the place, probably. Anyway, Leibniz summarized this conversation he has with Chironius, and he writes, I usually say that there are 3 degrees of infinity. I mean, I wonder about this usually because I didn't see many occasions where he talks about this, but so the lowest is for the sake of example like that of the asymptote of the hyperbola, and this I usually call the mere infinite, the tantum infinitum. It is greater than any assignable, as can be also said of the other degrees. The second is that which is greatest in its own kind. So maximum in Zeus genere, as for the example of the greatest of all extended thing is the whole space, the greatest of all successives is eternity. The third degree of eternity, and this is the highest degree, is everything, omnium. This kind of infinite is in God, since he's all one. Okay, so I mean, very, very sketchily, I think what he means by omnia clearly refers to God, the absolute infinity. What he means by the lowest degree, I think it's also quite clear that he talks about mathematical beings such as series and so on, that for Leibniz are basically all anti-rationalists, that is, they're beings of reason, they're not real. But the intermediate degree is kind of not so clear in the context. He might be referring to Spinoza's attribute. I mean, I think that's probably textually kind of a likely interpretation. This is it's been argued sort of against my interpretation. I'm not against it. I think it's probably right. I'm just saying there is sort of an open conjecture, I think, of an interesting use of this intermediate degree that it might apply to created beings, that in some sense, I mean, this is really interesting. They are infinite in some sense, but they're certainly, have to be distinguished from the infinity of God. So, they occupy this kind of in-between intermediate degree between sort of beings of reason and the absolute being of God. And so I think this idea of maximum in kind applies to other features in Leibniz's philosophy, but I hope to get to this later. Okay, I'm skipping the distinction between actual and potential infinity. There's just no time for this. I'll say a bit about the sympatogrammatic reading of infinity, which basically I think applies roughly to the quantitative sense of infinity. In his late writings, Leibniz refers to his own approach to infinity by using the scholastic distinction between the categorematic and sympatogrammatic use of the term infinity. Roughly speaking, if a term is used categorematically, it signifies a determinate thing, or as we might say today, it has a determinate reference. If a term is used sympatogrammatically, it does not by itself refer to a determinate thing or to a certain entity. For example, terms such as it and some are commonly used in meaningful sentences, but in themselves, they do not refer to determinate things. This points to the grammatical origin of the distinction. And indeed, this seems to be the point that Leibniz seeks to highlight by applying the term to the usage of infinity. If the term infinity is used sympatogrammatically, it would avoid the implications that it signifies a genuine whole or some determinate quantity, and would thus avoid the contradiction of an infinite number being obviously a determinate quantity. So in the new essays, he writes, it is perfectly correct to say that there is an infinity of things. That is, that there are always more than one can specify. But it is easy to demonstrate that there is no infinite number, nor any infinite line or other infinite quantity, if these are taken to be genuine whole. The scholastics were taking that view, or should have been doing so, when they allowed a sympatogrammatic infinite, as they called it, but not a categorematic one. Also, some more citations. He writes, speaking philosophically, I no more support infinitely small magnitudes than infinitely large ones, or no more infinitesimals than infinite tuples. For I consider both fictions of the mind due to abbreviated ways of speaking, suitable for calculation as imaginary roots in algebra are also. So the point is that this applies both to the infinitely large and the infinitely small. Both are, there are no infinitesimals as we know. This was Leibniz defense. They're just very useful fictions, but we don't have to admit that they truly exist in some robust sense. The idea that both infinitely small and infinitely large magnitudes are fictions, useful fictions, that is part and parcel of the same categorical interpretation of infinite terms. Rather than taking the infinite to be a signable fixed number or magnitude, the term infinite is seen as a variable. It is not used to designate a collection of units or any determinate thing. In seeing the use of infinite as unassignable and unspecified, Leibniz seeks to avoid the inconsistent notion of infinite number, for it is of the essence of any number to be finite and assignable. The point is not that the term infinite refers to an unassignable number, but rather that it does not refer at all. That it does not designate any whole or fixed quantity. Further, this syncretic approach seems to hold generally to any infinite quantity, large or small, numerical or otherwise. So in the Odyssey, he says, accurately speaking, in place of infinite number, we should say that more things are present than can be expressed by any number, or in place of infinite straight line, that a line is extended beyond any specifiable magnitude, so that there already remains a longer and longer line. It is of the essence of number, of line, of any whole whatsoever to be bounded. Okay. All right, so I'll switch to basically the last section because I see that I'm running out of time. I mean, there's more to be said about this logical interpretation, but I think you can understand the gist of it. Okay. While Leibniz rejects the notion of infinite number, he clearly accepts the notion of infinite series. The notion of a series plays a central role in the development of his mathematical work in general, and in the development of his decimal calculus in particular. But what is the difference that he sees between infinite series and the notion of infinite number, such that the one is regarded as consistent, while the other is regarded as inconsistent? One crucial difference is this: the notion of infinite series avoids the contradiction of an infinite number because it is not defined as a collection of units. Rather, it is defined through its law of generation or its rule of production. As Leibniz puts this, a series is a multitude with a rule of order. Such a rule, this is regular, can be regarded as a kind of generator whose activity produces ordered results. Leibniz employs here the same notion of generative definition that he uses to provide other real definitions. That is, by demonstrating that a given concept is consistent by showing how it is produced. In this sense, to define X is to show how the concept of X can be constructed, which also demonstrates its self-consistency. This attitude is also exemplified in Leibniz's demand for proving the possibility of the S perfectissimum and in disproving the possibility of the infinite number. Here, for simplicity's sake, let us contrast two notions that, on first sight, seem to be very similar: the notion of infinite number and the series of natural numbers. So it is crucial to observe that Leibniz does not see the series of natural numbers as a collection of units. Rather, he provides an operative definition. his definition is given by a procedure, by the procedures that generates a series, so that the successive number results from consecutive operations, that is, additions of units. This also comes up in the voice says. The reiterability of this procedure implies that it can be carried on without limitation, but it does not imply that there is an infinitely large number. For Leibniz's generative definition shows the intelligibility of the series of natural numbers. This also revealed another feature of Leibniz's analysis of infinity in this context, namely that it is bound up with the notion of activity, or more precisely, with the notion of potential activity of an agent, namely the possibility of continuing to carry on the procedure without an upper bound. Thus, while the infinite series is not seen as a sum of units, that is not, it is not a whole, one can speak of the law generating the series seen as a definition in act, and at the same time as what gives the series its unity and intelligibility. Something of this attitude is expressed when Leibniz notes that numbers do not in themselves go absolutely to infinity, since then there would be an infinite number. An infinite series requires a rule whose activity would generate it. Thanks to its formation law, one could speak of a series rather than seeing it as an aggregate or a collection of units. In this sense, the reality of infinite series, as well as other concepts involving infinity, presuppose the reality and activity of the mind thinking it. This sort of conceptualism about abstract entities, such as number and relations, is a familiar theme in Leibniz thought from his early writing and onwards. It is also had far-reaching consequences for current purposes, distinguishing between infinite being and infinite non-being, that is, beings of reasons, such as infinite series. So I quote here Massimo Mugnai, that I think has been argued for this for many years, and I think is absolutely right. Okay, so this conceptualist approach informs Leibniz's position that infinity is to be regarded as merely potential in the context of abstract and mathematical concepts, and that this type of potential infinity does not apply to the infinity of true being. The true beings are agents whose activity is not merely potential, but also actual. If their nature is to act, and if they never perish, then one might say that they always act. And they do so according to their intrinsic law, a law whose application generates a sequence of predicates that defines their very nature. Here I move on to the sort of how he envisions actual created things. Okay. So like the generative definition of the natural numbers, the notion of the law of the series is central both to Leibniz metaphysics in general and to the role infinity plays in his view of substance in particular. As he writes apropos Fouché comments in 1676, we have this here, no, this is here. So yeah, the essence of substances consists in the primitive force of acting. In the law of the series, in the law of the series of changes, like the nature of series in numbers. Leibniz is using the notion of the law of the series to define not only series of numbers, but also the very nature of true beings, that is, unfolding states of individual substances. He holds that every created being, that is, every individual substance is defined through its own law or his own law of production, which he likens to the law of the series. The law accounts for the individuality of a created substance as well as for its identity over time. This indicates that for Leibniz, all beings other than God are infinite in the sense that they are defined and individuated through an infinite and unique law of generation. The term generation has a dual sense in this context, It applies both to the generation of the individual concept in God mind, that is, as a possibility, if you like, and to its realization in the world once it is created and given power to act. We know that in the middle years, Leibniz developed the view that each individual has a complete concept, a concept that entails all its predicates. As he argues in the Discourse on Metaphysics, the complete concept of the individual includes everything true of it. Such a concept is infinite as well. The comparison between an individual complete concept, an individual, and the individual substance shows another sharp contrast between an infinite being, that is an individual substance, and individual non-being, that is its conceptual counterpart. In effect, this is a clear articulation of the contrast between concepts and agents in Leibniz's metaphysics. It goes without saying that a complete concept of an individual must be consistent. If an individual exists, as many surely do, then it must also be possible. That is, it must have a consistent concept or a perfect representation in God's understanding. Indeed, in the Discourse on Metaphysics and in ensuing correspondence with Arnaud, Leibniz illustrates cases with examples of historical individuals that we all know, as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Leibniz, however, is not so explicit about how such infinite concepts of individuals are to be defined. I'm almost done. In a previous work, I've argued that Leibniz sees complete concepts in terms of their real definitions. That is, through their method of production or the way they're thought in God understanding. Leibniz is very explicit that the concept of individual involves many predicates, which all serve to define the whole career of an individual, past, present, and future. Thus, each predicate is an essential component of the definition of that individual. However, such a concept would be seen as a mere conjunction of predicates or as a set of infinitely many predicates, it would be contradictory, just as any determinate infinite number of units. And for this reason, it seems that Leibniz thought about the infinite concept of an individual along the lines that he thought about an infinite series, that is, as defined by its law of generation. In fact, I take that this is why Leibniz found the notion of the law of the series so attractive in the first place, and why it plays such a central role in his metaphysics. What I'd like to stress here that in either version, the notion of the law or rule of production enables Leibniz to account for the infinity of individual substance without falling prey to the inconsistency involved in the notion of infinite number. Okay, and I'll just end by reading this citation that all individual things are successive, they're subject to succession. For me, he says nothing is permanent in those things except the very law that involves the continued succession, which in individual things corresponds to the law that is in the whole universe. So just to illustrate the idea that created things are also informed by sort of something analogous to the law of the series, that in other contexts he kind of likens to the soul. I mean, this is what permanent in things, and this is what defines what they are, maintains their identity over time, and so on and so forth. So it does a lot of physical works, but also what I'd like to argue that it does allow us in some sense to understand how he could argue, and this is a very radical claim at the time, that created things are infinite in some sense. Of course, I mean, there's hardly any precedence in the history of philosophy to this claim, but they're also, only infinite in kind. So they're not infinite as God. They're just in a sort of lower sense, in a lower degree, I want to suggest. All right, I feel that I talked too much already.
Thank you very much, Ohad. And questions, Ori?
I'm kind of perplexed about this distinction between the bubble series, which allows for a certain notion of infinity, and then reference to infinite number or infinite binary, which is not possible. How do you square the two of them together? Take, for example, the notion of space. Supposedly, I could describe space via law of series. And just say, whenever you have a segment of space, you extend it further by a certain law. But then you retrieve the infinite number by doing that. So how do you distinguish between the notion of infinite that doesn't refer and the law of series, which supposedly does refer?
So it's not just refer, does not refer. It also depends what we're talking about. So of course, space, for life, I don't know. Vincenzo de Risis argued that, his relative view of space comes only very late. But space is not a substance. Space is not an example of something that is truly existing, but it's rather, a possible order of things. So I don't think space is a good example in this regard, because I think he'll say that space is more like, it's more like a distance or something relative. So it's not an example of a true being. Well, perhaps I misunderstood your question, but it seems to me that space would go on the side of, ideal things or interactions. It's not a substance.
But you can articulate a law of series of segments, right? So how can you use this notion of the law of series to distinguish between an ideal and an actual being, when it seems like you can define the law of series defines an ideal series?
Yeah, no, of course, but that's not what I'm saying. The law of the series is used in both contexts. It used to define a mathematical series, but it can also be used to define an individual. So it's not the law of the series that makes the difference. It's in virtue of the law of the series that you could defend the idea that in both contexts you could talk about infinity and not fall to the that there's, while holding that there's no infinite number.
זה הנקודה הזאת או משהו אחר? אז לאו.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this very dense and intricate or dense talk about an intricate issue and where you try to help us understand. And I think this seems to be a very central issue in Leibniz. And I would like to ask you how, or to use this point to understand something broader about Leibniz, which I'm far from being an expert. But whenever I read anything of his text, I get the impression that even though according to timeline or to context or whatever, he's supposed to be well beyond, let's say, the scholastic thought or whatever. Whenever I read, I think I am reading some kind of scholastic text, and this is true. Well, perhaps because I don't have the entire picture, but in style and in topics and everything, it seems to be, having a conversation with some other scholastic, even though it said here the scholastics, like they over there. But to me, it would seem very similar the way that he approaches these issues. But then, on the other hand, specifically here, he uses or he goes against the mainstream, let's say, of some very central things to scholastic, like, for example, the infinite or accepting some kind of infinite or infinity as opposed to Aristotle. On the other hand, there is that part of the mathematical side, which of course is very important and in terms of the history of mathematics when he introduces the decimal and so on. But here he's like trying to say, no, well, but these are not real entities. These are he's using a caution that some mathematicians that I know of the more closer to the scholastic tradition they don't have problems with that. You know, they like the calculatores, they go on with infinite things and they don't even care. They just go or Cavaliere with the indivisible. So, and here also I was quite, it was strange to me that the second kind of infinity refers to space and time, which on the other hand, it's like he speaks about relative, so about them as relative entities, not absolute. So, even if I understand all of the components of what you in the talk, then I wonder where does it put him in this conversation with the scholastic? Like he's closer, or on the other hand, even though he preserves or maintains the style, but not the contents of what he's doing, or something like that.
So, I mean, it's a great question. And of course, I think, Leibniz is obviously one of the novators. I mean, he's of course one of the very in the front line of forming, making modern science. But at the same time, I think he's very explicit on the idea that he doesn't want to go too far with the moderns. I mean, the example of natural machine is a very good one. This is where he, there is a pushback against Descartes' idea that you could understand any living being, any animal as an artificial machine. And Leibniz says, no. This is not the right analogy. So these machines are created by God, yes, but this tells us something about the living kind of machines, and they are infinite. So we cannot put them together, we cannot put them together because simply they have a primitive unity. They're not made of parts. You cannot assemble, a cat. It's just, I mean, this is just to illustrate where I think he wants to move forward, but also maintain what you call scholastic or traditional spirit. So the moderns have gone too far. This idea of mechanizing the whole of nature, they're just gone too far. It's not only it has sort of bad consequences to religion and morality, which is Leibniz's deep concern. So in that regard, I think Leibniz is a curious combination of someone who is a very conservativist and very inventory spirit. But I think at heart, he's not shy about saying that in the history of philosophy, there are lots of good stuff that we should use. So he doesn't have this spirit that Descartes and the other, against, throw everything from the scholastic. He's very explicit about rehabilitating substantial forms, for instance, because you should put them to good service. So I think in this regard, Leibniz is a big conciliator, is both in his, as a diplomat, but he's also a philosophical diplomat. He wants to reconcile all true things and create, and in a way, I mean, I think this is very much the mark of his originality. He's not shy about taking different positions and sort of try to put them together, showing that there's no real contradiction between them.
And how does it play with the specific topic of infinity?
So
that's not very conservative.
Yeah. So here you can see, he's very much against Aristotle. He's, of course, he's in favor of actual infinity, which is a very radical position. I mean, most people would say there's no, but then he's also, I think, the idea that he sees infinity in nature is a very radical position. It's something that from a theological point of view is almost heresy, to say that things are infinite. It's like, oh, no. Descartes is very clear, infinite only applies to God. You don't even use the term if you don't talk about God. It's, he invents this idea of indefinite. But Leibniz is with Pascal, it's the same story, Pascal used the infinity to get us back to God, right? We have this horror from the infinite universe, and the infinity is flawed, and we're lost. And then says, no, infinity is okay. We can understand it. Just, why? So I think you have both an attitude that is very novel and very extremely original, but also I think in his deep sentiments are with, you might say, with the ancients, or with the sort of old theology. Like he doesn't want to go against religion for sure. Huh?
I'm a bit confused about the infinity of the living things, because at the beginning you were saying that all things are living and they have living. It's like unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and then I understand that actually it's infinite, like the law of series. But then if I need to ask it in a segment of time, in a certain moment of time. So my question is about time. So are the living things are finite or infinite? Because they don't, in a certain moment of time, you can actually count it. Or is this another sort of notion of infinity, regardless of the amount of living things that are there, that has to be about the inherent nature of them?
Mm-hmm. So if we
Because
take
the series, the mathematical series that I see is always calling, always infinite, and always there. So it's always generated to the.
yeah. So I think you're right that there is this duality. I mean, you could think, for instance, of I don't know of whatever, Julius Caesar, right? So you have the complete concept of Julius Caesar. There is, let's assume with Leibniz there is a law of the series that, so to speak, sequences all its predicate and so on. But this is conceived in God's mind before, so to speak, before creation. I mean, right? He talks about possible Caesar. So you have this idea of possibility that is already, I think, defined through something like a law of the series and an infinite. And then, you have the actual Caesar, and Caesar lives a certain number of times, and the sort of in living you have a transition from one state to another. So there's the sequence sort of plays out, and then he dies, right? But when he dies, he doesn't really die for life. Things don't really perish. There is some sort of transformation, and so I mean, I hope I'm answering your question. I think in one sense.
Hope for the future, then.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, and he says very clearly that the complete concept defines past, present, and future, everything that is true of an individual.
Okay.
So it is timeless in some sense.
Yeah.
Go on.
So basically, I don't understand anything about finance, so this is maybe a very stupid question. But it seems to me that a lot hangs on what we mean by exists or being in all these discussions. And since I don't know anything about what Leibniz means by these terms, maybe you can help me, because it seems to me that a lot of what it means to be, whether it's a series or the infinite, or all of these talk about what it means to exist. I just
So I think that's right, and I basically, I mean, this is something that Maria Rosa Antoniazza, whom Osvaldo knows well, suggested, and I think she's right that you could think of this the threefold degrees of infinity sort of along the line of Neoplatonic sort of degrees of being. So God is sort of the one ultimate being, and that notion of being is really, I mean, we should use being, or this Greek notion of being that it's not, I mean, the contemporary notion of existence is very different, because I mean, and this is, well, this is before Kant, but in Leibniz already you have the idea that the world is created from, so to speak, definition of possible things. So possible things don't really exist. They exist in a theoretical, in the mind of God and so on. But once the thing is created, then it exists. But this, we're talking about, I don't know, about ourselves and so on. So I agree that's a very different notion of existence. And because, well, it's created, it's temporal and so on. And then, for the third kind, you could say there, I think the scholastic discussions are very helpful. I mean, we know how to locate these antirationalists. They're kind of in the conceptualist tradition. So they're in the mind. For Leibniz, is in God's mind, but also the fact that human beings think it is also, adds a certain notion of existence. But these are, this is the lowest degree of existence. So basically, you have a hierarchy of from being to, you might say, the existence of created things to the existence of interaction, so it's beings and trees.
Snail?
So you actually started to answer my question in your last sentence. I was going to ask you, could you elaborate on the various roles of hierarchy in Leibniz? Not only, I mean, in monadology, it's very clear, but also here, the hierarchy of infinites and so on and so forth. So how does it work with this notion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question. I mean, I think you're right. There are various notions of hierarchy. I just referred to the, hierarchy of being that I think corresponds to the hierarchy of, you might say, degrees of infinity, or he actually talks about more in terms of degrees of perfection. And I think, like that we have in the definition of the ens perfectissimum, the notion of perfections. It's so the most perfect, and then we have some perfections, but in a limited sense. So perfections in a limited way, and that makes it sort of lower in the hierarchy, but still higher than these beings that have less perfections, or and so I'm not sure. I mean, so this is one context that the hierarchy is very important. There is within the understanding of every organism or every living being, we also have this very important hierarchy between, he talks about, I didn't talk about that here, but it's the, the dominant monad versus the subordinated monad. So we have, I also understand this as something that has to do with we might say the telos of an organism, which corresponds to the sort of the prime law, but the law, as we know it, I think Leibniz makes use of this idea that a law can contain sub-laws. So you could have this idea of I mean, today we're talking about fractals and so on, but the idea that things could go to infinity within the same sort of thing, which is also why I like this picture. It kind of demonstrates that idea that you could maintain the same structure, presumably generated by similar law. And we know this is everywhere in nature. I mean, not everywhere, but in many contexts. So there is a very interesting hierarchy within each living being, and so this relations between the dominant monad and the subordinated monad. And there are two, I mean, it's very perplexing, but every, we're, so to speak, for Leibniz, consists of infinitely many things, and that order is, so there's a sense of hierarchy, but there's also a sense of, in the living world, I think there is a sense in which the hierarchy is not so important, because it's more important that there are these relations between the parts and the whole that are in what's the word, that every part, every constituent contributes to the whole organism, and so you can't, in some way, the whole structure is important to identifying the whole organism. You can't just
Organisms are not organized, I mean, hierarchically because of the relations between parts and wholes of each one of them.
Because you need everything for Leibniz. Like, it's not, every bit of it is a necessary component of the thing. So that I think the notion of, if there is a hierarchy, it's a different one. It's not just top bottom and the sort of more intuitive sense.
Please.
So very happy to get this toolbox to understand Leibniz, because I know nothing about Leibniz, so I'm happy for this opportunity. And as I see, like, the main tools in this toolbox are three distinctions. One is between three types of things,
So it's the omnia and the maxima and the infinitum. And the other one, the other two are about properties of things. So we have the qualitative versus quantitative, and categorematic versus syncretic. But I'm not very clear about the relations between all those. For example, so I understand the infinitum is quantitative type of infinity, whereas the omnia is qualitative. But what about the middle one, the maxima? Is it quantitative or qualitative, for example?
Yeah.
How will it help? Clarify?
So, in the book, I argued for something that I don't know if I can really defend. I mean, people like Richard have sort of attacked this a bit. But what I wanted to say, look, in Leibniz, for instance, you have the dynamica, the which he invents. It's another thing he invents, which he wants to say you cannot reduce it to quantity. But you could still have, for instance, you could have the law of the preservation of Visviva and the law of preservation of force. It's mv squared. You have a formula. So in one sense it's quantitative, but in one sense it's not quantitative. I mean, I would like this intermediate degree to convey something of that sort. That in some sense, we are, for instance, in some sense infinite, but not infinite like God. We're also limited. So this idea that you're infinite in one sense. So for me, the analogy of space is, think of the second degree as, you have a line that, so you start from a certain point. You could think of infinity that goes to one direction, but then you could think of infinity that goes to the other, and you can think of infinity in all directions. So, I mean, each line is already infinite, but it's not infinite in the maximal sense, right? It's infinite in one particular sense. And the sort of analogy that I use is, I think each individual for Leibniz is infinite in one determinate sense. It has a particular sort of course of action to realize. And in that sense, it's individual. And we know that there's just such one, right? The law of identity of indiscernible rules that there could be two things that are exactly alike. So, yeah, it's sort of the intermediate. This is kind of the metaphysical work that I'd like it to do. I mean, whether it succeeds, I don't know. There are complications, but this is where I would like to go.
I have a question myself, which is somewhat I think it's connected to that. In this second degree, the examples that Leibniz gave, at least those you gave from Leibniz, were time and space. And both of them have some kind, it's not so clear whether they are actually exist or potentially exist, because even time is the one thing that was also infinite for Aristotle. That this eternity is infinite, but it's so. I think so. It's not so clear to me whether what you talk about. That's something that you skip in your talk about the actual and the potential. So
Right.
When does we talk about the infinite as something which is actual, like God is? This is quite clear, but this is not so new, because that was
Right.
one of the attributes of God. But what are the other things? Are they actual, potential? What's the meaning of their? It's connected also to the meaning of their existence.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you want to make the distinction, to make it very simple, probably simplifying the distinction, you could say that potential infinity is a way when you talk about ideal things. So, you could take a segment and divide it however much you like. But you could divide it however much you like, because it's not a real thing. But if you talk about an actual thing like God or like me, it's already divided. I mean, and Leibniz says it's already divided to infinity. Like, he takes this very radical position. So now for time and space, I don't know that I can speak very clearly about this, but I had thought that this falls in the, space is the order of possible situation. It's kind of tricky. It's a tricky definition. I mean, I don't know, maybe Dustin has some clear ideas about that. But I want to say this, that, I mean, just recently, and in fact, in his critique of the book, and it's going to be published soon at the Leibniz Review, what Richard Arthur makes a very interesting suggestion, and it is that the law of the series, he says, is applied to sort of to time slices, but not to space. And the idea of space should be understood, or the spatial, let's say, configuration of a living being should be understood differently. And I think it's a very interesting suggestion. I think he might be right. I mean, but I didn't really think thoroughly about this. But it's a very good, I think it's a very good, interesting direction to go. Oli?
I want to push you a little bit on your interpretation of infinite in its own kind. Even when you look at this quote that you brought, which is following the interaction with the ethics, I think maybe an indirect interaction, but still, in Spinoza, you have a very specific notion of infinite in its own kind, which is infinite under a certain attribute. But you want to make it sort of continuous with this individuals which are infinite in their kind, and it seems a little bit of a stretch because kind is natural. So wanted to see what you have to say.
So it is a stretch. I totally admit it, and I present it as such. Textually, I think careful readers who are more textualist than me, like. I don't know what Osvaldo thinks about this, but I think Richard Arthur is right. It seems that given that it's in the context of Spinoza philosophy, probably Leibniz thinks about something like attributes. But I want to use the distinction, for doing some more interpretive work. I mean, so as an interpreter, I think it is a stretch. I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I like the stretch. I think it works. I mean, I think it does some.
The individual be a kind because individuals are sort of kind for Leibniz? Is that what you're going to say?
It's tricky, each individual there's just it's a kind, there's just a single kind, right? It's a single. But this is what an individual is. I mean, it also it defines, if you want to sort of sort everything that exists in the world, you look at the individuals and they're in the sense yeah, each of them, is infinite in its own kind. I mean, it's unique. Yeah, of course. I mean, look, the question applies not to me. In this question, you should apply to the complete concept. How could you have a complete concept of an individual? The problem is already there. I mean, Leibniz is happy with this. I mean, this is crazy. A concept does not apply to an individual. A concept, by definition, is something that applies to certain things, but Leibniz wants to have a complete concept of an individual. So that problem, I mean, that is textually established and it's there. I'm not inventing anything. This is like, I just want to sort of say that such a definition maybe, could be seen as sort of, infinite in its kind. That's all I'm doing. I mean, I think the textual grounding for this are pretty firm. Hannah?
Yeah, thank you. So I have to join some of the previous speakers and say I'm not an expert in Leibniz, but I'm still curious about something. So the first quote you gave us, I find this interesting when he's talking about
the very first?
Not here on this slide. So the first one.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so when he talked about that the only thing that's permanent about things is basically their succession. And I was wondering, is there something like a mathematization of like metaphysical concepts happening? Because I'm thinking like, I know Descartes tried to mathematize like medicine and stuff like this, and I'm wondering, like, I think if you ask an Aristotelian, they would say the only thing that's stable about these things that are part of generation and corruption is their nature. They have a nature that is stable in them. And to me, it sounds like he's getting rid of this idea of a stable nature that defines the thing as it is. And instead, he has this idea of succession of things, which is, of course, as you explained, us very problematic.
Yeah, exactly, but there is a succession and there is a law of succession, and the law remains the same.
Yeah.
And this is the only thing. This is why, it's invariant, it remains the same, this is why it would define that individual.
Yeah, but my question is more, so is he trying to reinterpret certain metaphysical concepts, maybe through like mathematical notions?
I think so, I think he does use the mathematical idea of a series. I mean, it's an analogy after all, but I think he uses this analogy very, like he does a lot of, he puts it into metaphysical use, yes. It's going to define that individual over time because we're a succession of states, but the individual remains the same. It's going to make it the same the individual that it is because it includes all the predicates that are part of the complete concept and so on. So yeah.
But he has no more notion of an age.
I think he has this notion of an age. This plays the role of, if you want, it does have a notion of a telos because it proceeds towards certain direction. So it does, I mean, for him, it's increased perfection and so on. So, I mean, there's something Aristotelian in this as well. He does, I think he does maintain this idea of a nature. It's a particular nature.
He has the succession here is connected to the fact that time is not continuous in a sense.
Yeah.
So it has
Yeah.
Ishban?
I'm not sure if I'm asking a very basic question, too complicated the question for this forum. Obviously, this stuff drew me back to 20 years ago to my calculus lesson, and I'm not sure I remember correctly, but when he speaks about something that it's not infinite, but you can always add a finite something, or to the smaller part, you can always find a smaller quantity which is finite, but it sounds to me quite similar to Cauchy's formulations of for every epsilon you can just exist, and I would, and maybe it's not fair to ask this question in this form, but what's the difference? Like, did Cauchy simply generalize what Leibniz already passed?
So I don't know, I can't answer, with any authority, maybe Dustin can. But I think what's going on is there is a further formalization of these ideas. So it gets a mathematical formalization that was not there at the time. There was, the idea.
No, it's not just a formalization, it's quite a completely different idea, because it's infinitesimal. And Cauchy tries to build on a more arithmetical fashion, which also has some view of continuous magnitude, which even Cauchy was not very sure about that. But it's precisely moving away from the idea, from the mathematical idea of Leibniz into quite completely different universe.
But the notion that
Philosophically is not so far.
Yeah,
but the notion that you actually don't have an infinitely small quantity, but you can just always find something smaller. It's what it takes here. No?
No, and I don't think.
No, not in the not in the mathematics, because in the mathematics he has something which is totally infinite, but he says that it's not. That Leibniz says that it's only in the mathematics, but we don't look at it philosophically. That's what I understood from you.
No, even in the mathematics, you don't have something that you could just play as if, you play as if there is, there is something, but in reality, we know there is, there isn't, you'll never reach any point that is infinitely small. There's no such a thing. But you can pretend, it's very useful, you could go as small as you like, depending on what you're trying to do,
Isn't infinity equates to no boundaries? Does it equate if you don't have any boundaries? Does it mean infinity? And if you have infinity, does it mean you don't have any boundaries?
Well, you can have, you have boundaries. I mean, you know, suppose you go on dividing between 1 and 0, you have a boundary, that's.
No, the boundary, but you're not bounded by how many times you can divide, you're bounded by time.
Yeah, this is where Leibniz thinks of it as, you know, potentially infinite. Potentially you could, you know, could go as much as you like. You have no boundary in this regard.
So, but we do have boundaries. Time. So thank you very much, Ohad, again for the talk. And you're all invited to join us in the pub here. The book is for